we are just about to get started in our fourth session. If you are with us, it's because you want to be in learning with the group, with the dinner party on collective care in the workplace, building cultures of support during times of loss. And we are going to get started. So this is being recorded. And again, Carla, I'm just going to invite you to figure out a way to keep the mouse in one location so that for visual cueing it's supportive. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Carol. Welcome from Massachusetts and Ohio. This event is being captioned, so if having subtitles helps your accessibility, either because of audio or because of anything else, you can go down to the bottom of the bar and click on closed caption, and you'll be able to see everything in subtitle captioning. Thank you, thank you, thank you to our closed captioners. It's a big job. We're going to move ahead, so if we can do next slide. Thank you. So a couple housekeeping pieces. If this is the first session that you're having with us, this is the first time you're hearing it. And if it's the fourth, second, third, or fourth, it's you know the drill, but I'm going to say it one more time. Everyone will be muted during this session and won't be able to share video. The way that you can most participate is in the chat box or asking questions in the Q&A. So at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat icon and a Q&A icon. If you have really big questions, please put them there. We're going to be answering all questions at the very end. So if you don't see your question answered, it doesn't mean that we're ignoring you. It just means we're holding them and we're tracking them until the very end. But if you have quick questions, you can put them in the Q&A box, and the dinner party team and myself and Heather, we're going to try and get to them as soon as we can. And if you would like to share or have a comment for everyone to see, please put it in the chat box, all panelists and attendees. And of course, we encourage everything that you're sharing to be supportive and resourceful and contributive to the conversation. And at the end of today, you're going to get a brief survey. We really want to welcome you to take that survey because, as you may or may not remember, everyone who is teaching day 1 and day 2 is coming back for our November sessions, the 12th and the 13th, for a more applied workshop-y 2.0 feel of this content. So everything that you let us know in the chat box, in your survey, goes back to presenters to help us make sure that the programming in November is exactly what you need, or as much as possible. And if you're interested in a certificate, please make sure you'll get an email, and you will have had to attend for at least half of the session. And we hope you stay on for all of the session. And of course, do follow us. So this session, as all of the sessions, are being recorded, and all the PDFs of the decks are going to be uploaded on our main event webpage. Heather, Heather already did it. That's because Heather is who Heather is. In the chat box, that is the link that you can access all the recordings and all the slides for all of our presentations. Let's do the next slide. Okay, so a couple last pieces before I hand it over to the dinner party. As you may know, we also just put out a couple fact sheets to help your grief sensitivity learning and knowledge acquisition. So you can access those fact sheets on the webpage that's below. And you'll be able to get all the resources on that webpage. And I think those are fantastic resources. I am seeing some technical housekeeping questions, so I'm going to take time to answer them. So the transcripts are in, I think, Heather, if you can answer that question. Oh, Heather just answered all, these are all the fact sheets. Okay, I'm going to scroll up. So Heather, we have a question about where to find transcripts, but I'm going to answer Dana's question. So yes, we will be sending everyone who participated in all of the sessions, the workshop evaluations, and you'll be able to give feedback in that way. Thank you so much, Dana, for asking. We love people who ask for evaluation forms. That's so nice. And then Heather, maybe in the chat box, if you can put the answer to the transcript question, that would be helpful. Okay. Next slide, Carla. Thank you. And last but not least on this piece, we know that a lot of you, and I know this because we just came from the grief sensitivity breakout group, that a lot of you are holding deep, deep, deep big, 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 expansive feelings, both professionally and personally, always and today or yesterday because of these conversations, or because it's 9/11, or because of all the different reasons that things could come up. So we really want to encourage you to engage in the learning that is going to be most supportive to you, meaning if you want to stand up and walk around while you're listening to Carla, Justin, and Ayana, if you want to take drink water, if you need help, here are the resources for you. If you want to have a dance party, whatever feels good, just do that, right? We like the dance party. Okay, let's move forward. Okay, and very last but not least, if you are new to us, we are a collaboration of networks across the country that are funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration to provide no-cost technical assistance to support the mental health workforce. So this event, yesterday and today, is a product of that. There are 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native, and also a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. I'm going to ask all my colleagues, including all my colleagues, to mute themselves if you are on the presenter panel. Thank you. And then we are, so that is who we are. That is who we are. We're going to move forward so I can show you the map. So again, you've probably seen this map a lot before, but I just want to remind you that you have regional centers. You have a Pacific Southwest Mental Health TA Center. That's the one that I and my team support. You've got many other centers in your region that you can access. And of course, you can access our national coordinating office that runs kind of information highways. And there is basically no wrong door, because we will get you to your people or your region for all that you need. But this is the map to let you know that we are a nationwide collaborative, and this event is an outcome of that collaboration. And moving again. So the very last piece is that we, as I mentioned earlier, we're funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, and we just want to thank SAMHSA for support and funding, but also know that all things that are presented are of the opinion and discretion of the presenter and not of SAMHSA itself. And moving forward, here we are. Okay, I'm going to take a breath. I just want to say, for all of you who are with us today, the almost 150 of you who are with us today, the dinner party, and we have the founder, Carla Fernandez, and staff and team here with us. The dinner party has been a national leader in transforming the way that we talk about grief, the way that we talk about death, the way that we talk about life after loss. And I have been fortunate to be in community with the dinner party for now almost 9 years, Carla, which is pretty wild, because I myself was a beneficiary of the dinner party's programming in my own grief and in my own grief leadership and healing. And I have been able to see the way that the dinner party has been transforming the way that our country and many countries internationally talk about grief at work, and grief in many stages of life that don't usually get that attention. So it is my honor and my excitement to present the dinner party. And again, I'm going to remind you, they'll let you know who they are, but I'm going to remind you, big questions in the Q&A, comments in the chat box, and without further ado, the dinner party.
Great. Thank you, Leora. I can think of no one who I would rather be introduced by. So nice to be here with you. Thanks for inviting us to be a part of this. So we're just gonna dive right in. I'm Carla, co-founder. I'm joined by Ayana Malcolm, our director of BIPOC Wellness, and Justin Thongsavan, who leads our partnerships and operations. And we will just dive right in. So today's session, we have a few different sort of areas that we're focusing on. We're going to introduce you to the work that the dinner party is doing. We have a feeling that it might be a resource for people in the communities where you live and work. We are going to share some of the lessons that we've learned as we have been making our way through COVID and taking a program that is designed to be experienced in people's living rooms in small towns and cities across the country and going completely online. So we'll share some of those lessons. And we're also going to talk you through a program we've launched this year that's all about creating more grief-sensitive, more emotionally resilient workplaces. Introducing the elephant of grief at work first requires us to understand what's the actual problem we're solving there. So we'll take you through some of those learnings that we've done. And our intention, depending on the feedback that we get from you guys in the survey, is the next session when we return in November, I think it is, we'll actually be leading you through a process where you can develop your own loss readiness plan for your organization. So today will be mostly sort of us talking at you and then doing a Q&A at the end. And then the next session will be a little bit more interactive. So we hope you come back for that one too. First of all, Leora already touched on this so thoughtfully, but big exhale. It's Friday, first of all. It's September 11th, second of all. This has been a hard day and a hard week and a hard month and a super challenging, hard year. And just want to thank you all for being here to listen. And our hope and intention is that you walk away with some new tools and some new ideas to support the communities where you work. But as Leora mentioned, we are all also human beings going through this challenging time. So just want to honor that. And thank you again for making the time to be here with us. So the dinner party, the organization that I helped co-found, we call it fondly TDP. You'll see that acronym in here. So I feel like this is a group that's not scared of acronyms. Our community is based around this premise that we're a community of people who've all experienced a significant loss and are not afraid to talk about it. So the majority of our community are 20 and 40 somethings, and we are very much sort of for us by us. We were founded by a group of people who had all experienced significant loss and found that there were resources and places and support groups really lacking for people in that sort of young adult millennial age frame. We've gotten really good at grief support resources for kids and places where kids can be kids when they're grieving. There are grief support centers and groups available for people that are generally catered more to experiencing loss at a sort of more natural time in life, so later in life. But there was really a missing, there's a big gap, a missing resource for people in their 20s and 30s who might not yet have a family of their own, but don't live with family anymore, who are sort of in a transitory younger part of their life. And what we do is actually bring people together to have dinner parties to talk about their loss, but everything that happens in life after. And this community, actually, what's sort of serendipitous about today is we hosted our first dinner 10 years ago tomorrow night. We just dug back through the archives, and it was September 12th, 2010 that we started what we thought was sort of a social experiment of what happens when we bring people together, and instead of avoiding the topic that's right under the surface, the experience of grief and loss, what if we make it, so to speak, the main dish of a meal and really focus our conversation there? And since that sort of first dinner, we have grown to a community that spans over 100 cities, mostly in the US, but some international. We've had over 10,000 people who have sat down with us to talk about their loss. And we have about 4,000 people who are active currently joining tables that are now obviously all virtual, which we will share more about in a minute. And we've been very lucky in that the work that we've done has inspired people to tell the story. We've been featured in about a dozen books and case studies around how to manage stress, how do millennials find meaning and purpose in their lives, and what does it mean to sort of reinvent what support structures and community looks like in 21st century. And the deeper we've gotten to the work, we've realized that while grief is a thing that brought us to the table, it's not actually the problem that we're solving. And in fact, grief isn't a problem that we can solve, and loss isn't something that we can ever stop or fix. We can never save someone from these emotions. It's a natural part of metabolizing life experiences, as I'm sure so many of you know. But what we can work on and what we can make better is the loneliness that comes with feeling the grief. We know we're zooming out and looking at all these trends around the crisis of isolation, that 40% of adults in the US report feeling lonely. We have fewer and fewer people with whom we can talk to about what's really going on. We're seeing an increase in the suicide rate, with other desperation-related losses surely to go up after this really challenging year. But what we're really inspired by and what our community is really rallying around and really creating here is, how do we fight the crisis of isolation, not by avoiding these hard topics like grief and loss, but actually building community around it? We love this quote from the former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy talking about turning our sources of pain actually into our sources of power and sources of deeper community and connection. How do we create spaces that aren't purely institutional, but spaces that are peer-led, where people can show up for one another and be their own best expert? Vivek Murthy talks about being the medicine that each other needs. We can actually be the solution other people crave. We can all be doctors and all be healers. The question is, do we have the courage to speak up and to stand up for others, to reach out to them when they feel they may be in need? So the dinner party platform is really designed to allow people who are craving that connection to come in, to get matched with others in their community who they can meet with regularly over time, and to build friendships that are much more than just about the story of loss, but about the story of the lives they want to lead. And we're learning is that healing is collective. I think for so much of the cultural dialogue around healing is it's between a doctor and a person, or it's self-care looking like putting in your earbuds and doing a meditation audio track alone. But more and more what we're learning is that really deep healing also requires community and people to sit with and to hold each other with. So how do we thread the needle of the fact that we're now living in a time where we need that social connection more than ever, but can't actually do it in any kind of proximity? So I'm gonna hand it over to Ayana, our director of BIPOC Wellness, who's gonna take you through the lessons we've learned from the last 6 months, where we have been experimenting and scraping our knees and figuring out how do we actually create intimacy between people at scale. And what's been surprising, not to just silver lining any of this, what's been surprising is it's going virtual is actually helping our work get deeper in many different instances. And all of it is very simple adjustments we've made that we'd be happy to share with you, and might help inform how you're running collective care within your communities too. All right, so I'm gonna go on mute and I'm gonna hand it over to Ayana.
Thank you, Carla, and hello, everyone. Excuse me as I allergy cough my way through this, but so happy to be with you. So just want to share lessons that we've learned from the last 6 months. What Carla has mentioned is correct, is that we've been surprised at the level of connection that we've seen come out of virtual spaces when we had originally intended to be primarily a physically space-based organization. So since May, we've launched 55 new virtual tables, serving 680 dinner partiers. 100% so we sent out a survey, and 100% of 113 respondents said that they would recommend virtual tables to a friend. So traditionally, we have been, throughout the United States and internationally, an organization that matched a host to 8 to 12 dinner partiers. And we matched depending on loss, age, and region. And sometimes if we were lucky enough, we were able to match you with hobbies and with interests. And when the pandemic came about, we switched into virtual spaces, we wondered how that would play out. And what we saw was that people were desperate for the need for connection. And we've had quite a lot of success with the number of tables we've been able, and the amount of people we've been able to connect to each other. So we've individually matched 434 dinner partiers. So we started something called the buddy system. So our tables, as we mentioned, have a host, and then they have dinner partiers. The buddy system are for those who would rather not be in a larger group, and for those who perhaps would prefer not to sit on this kind of, we're on Zoom, we're looking at each other, we're having interactive conversation. For the buddy system, you can be on text or email. Which has allowed introverts all over the world to find the support that they need. Since May, we've trained 23 hosts and connected an additional 150 people of any age around the world to one of 15 new tables throughout our partnership with Option B.
Cool, and I'm gonna jump in and give a little more context here. Option B is a foundation that Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, started in the year probably after her husband died suddenly. And they are had been connecting people virtually, mostly just through Facebook groups who've all experienced different loss experiences, death loss being one of them. And we've been partnering with them this year to basically take the methodology that we use of creating small peer-led groups that are all united around a particular pain point, in this case, death loss, to have ongoing connection and community. So we're less interested in the one-off experience, wasn't that nice, but no real relationships were formed. What we're really kind of passionate about and in the business of is creating an ongoing cadence where people go from being strangers on a Zoom to folks that you would call if you're having a hard day, or someone that you would send a birthday card to, or in some way have each other's backs. And why we wanted to call out the Option B partnership is they have their community that they're running. We've come in to help them scaffold a collective care structure. We spent about 6 months kind of shadowing them and helping them build it. And just this month, they're kind of like, their rockets leaving the launch pad, so to speak, and they'll be running their dinner party circles within their community independently. So one way that we're starting to work with organizations is basically white labeling, for lack of a better term, the tools and the approach that we've built for any community that's looking for a way to organize that's peer-to-peer.
Thank you, Carla.
Anything.
So we've also launched our new workplace initiative. So what is important to notice about this time in 2020, when we are dealing with a pandemic and a civil rights movement and this election, is that it is impossible now to separate our work from our personal lives and our grief from our workload. And so while managers and employers used to be able to keep themselves a bit separate and perhaps send the obligatory card or email, now we realize that we really do have to show up more for our employees. And that our employees need their managers and their leaders to step up in a way that perhaps managers have not been trained in, or leaders have not been trained in previously. And so this program is really about equipping managers, leaders, CEOs with the tools so that they can continue to have effective productivity in their business, employees that feel safe and want to be productive, and they can put structures into place that can be a catch-all for what is inevitably going to continue to roll out through this year, and perhaps next, and perhaps the year that follows. What we're learning. So physical access is no longer a barrier. So as we've mentioned, we've had tables throughout the United States and international. We've had tables throughout Canada. And there are times where grief prevents you from leaving your home. Whether that's because of there are times where the physical space prevents you from leaving your home. So whether that's because you're dealing heavily in grief and you're just not able to get yourself together to leave your home, whether that's because of weather, whether that's because of responsibilities, children, partnerships. What we've noticed as moving into the virtual space, people can now just sign on, right? So you can be really heavy in your grief, keep your video camera off, and still be able to have these kind of connections. If you live 30 miles from somebody and there's a snowstorm, but you still need someone to show up for you, you can sign on now. If you don't have a car, if you're not able to because you don't have a babysitter, but you still need help, you can now do that. So one of the quotes that came to us was, "It's been so helpful for me as a mom of young kids with obligations that make it hard to meet in person even in normal times. I'm so grateful to get to have this experience in a virtual format and connect with others in similar situations when we are all struggling with the pandemic on top of our other forms of grief." It's easier to find your people when geography isn't a factor. So what we've seen are that there is a need and a use, and use is the wrong word. There's a need for spaces that are general loss, in terms of everyone at the table has been brought together because they share a loss. However, somebody might have lost a partner, somebody might have lost a parent, a child. There are people where having someone who is your mirror in your loss type or mirror in your culture, where that is also an extremely important part of your grief healing journey. And if you were in a town that perhaps we didn't have any other applications from someone who had also experienced homicide, was a person of color, had lost an infant. And we weren't able to match you with those people because they didn't live in your zip code. Now we don't have that obstacle. And so for people who have stepped up and said, I want to connect only with women of this faith who have suffered this loss, we're really able to put that call out and to connect you to those people now. And it's been truly incredible to see how many people have asked for that and how well we've been able to provide them for the mirrors that they need. One person of color in your group does not diversity make. So something that I think that has been highlighted by the civil rights movement, but certainly is something that has been present, is that in grief spaces, we've often only given one voice. And in this time, there is a necessity to hear more than that one voice. What we found is that when people are moving through their grief journey, it can allow a certain level of vulnerability and authenticity when you have someone to whom you don't have to explain your culture or what your family thinks or how they process things. Where we used to focus highly on making sure that you felt safe and supported with someone whose loss was similar to yours, we now are aware and are answering the call for, you also want someone who looks like you. You need somebody whose family moves or has traditions that seem like yours. And so we are actively making sure that you are not just held in your grief, but also in what you identify as. More frequent gatherings mean it takes less time to form deeper connections. So we used to only be able to meet once in a while because we were physically separated, right? And so maybe tables would meet once a month. There were tables that were meeting once every other month. And that worked for them, and that was what the time called for. Now we're seeing that people are meeting often. And so it's taking less time to become closer and to have those conversations that lead you to the space that you need to heal collectively. Excuse me. Sometimes one person is all it takes. And so while we might have needed to be in large social gatherings before, we're finding that sometimes that text message is literally exactly what you need. That one person to email is exactly what you need. And the buddy system has answered that call. It's really been incredible to have people who typically find it very difficult to speak in large groups, to show up in large spaces, that they can show up at 3 a.m. and text someone who might be in a different time zone and receive that conversation and dialogue. And sometimes it's just someone to vent to. It's just someone to say, today sucks, and to not have that whole conversation. And what we're seeing is that there are so many different variations to what people need in this moment. And that if we are able to equip people with the tools, they can make the decision for themselves on what serves them best. And so there are people that move throughout these systems. We have people who are at virtual tables and who also have buddies. And that's because perhaps in the space of when your table is meeting, you might want to talk to someone at 9 a.m. when you first wake up. And so it's nice to have somebody who expects that and who's ready to answer. It's possible to spark vulnerable, authentic conversation through a screen with people you may have never met in person. This has been the most surprising for me, and something that I found to be really interesting to watch. On Fridays, I facilitate a POC space, and that happens every Friday evening. And what I've seen in our space as something that I've watched really grow over the last, well, since May, but what I've heard is happening at other tables as well, is that it's broke down barriers. So when you're sitting in person and something moves you or triggers you in your loss, there are people for whom crying in public is not a thing. Sitting in a group of people and having an emotional response is never going to happen. They can do that online by turning their camera off. They can do that online because they're sitting in their home in a space that they feel safe and comfortable in. We've seen that there are people who typically, when they are arriving in someone else's physical space, feel a boundary because you're in someone else's home. When you're able to be in your home, and whether you're sitting at your dinner table or locked in your bedroom or sitting in a closet because your kids are screaming, it's still the space that you feel most comfortable. And so you're willing to open up more. I think there's also a matter of knowing that when you have that emotional release, you don't have to get in your car and drive home. Your bed is right there, your couch is right there, that bottle of wine is right there if that's what's calling you. And so people are much more willing to access emotions that they normally wouldn't have in the physical space.
Cool. Thank you, Ayana. So we're going to shift gears and talk about the workplace, but I'm hoping from that intro you have a better sense of who we are and the work we do and the community we've created. Hopefully you're getting intrigued about the idea that there has been a missing piece of the puzzle, which is places for peer-led collective care, and that it's really helpful to have someone who can relate to what you're going through, who's not, you know, your therapist or a social worker or someone who's sort of institutionally mandated to work with you, but someone who just gets it because they're living it too. In no way replacing those forms of support, but as like a very important complement. And you know, so many of the things that Ayana just talked you through required no like fancy proprietary technology. A lot of this, to be very transparent, is like duct taped together with Google Forms and Gmail, etc. So the tools that we've developed are really simple, and it feels like it has more to do with sort of a methodology and a way of looking at how do we solve this problem of isolation and realizing that people can be the best medicine for one another. And we also do a lot of uplifting stories of people who've experienced significant loss and go on to live the most like amazing dreams of lives. And I want to just hype woman Ayana Malcolm, who's calling in from her school bus with her gorgeous husband and dog that she renovated and is now driving across the country. So that wasn't a part of the official programming, but I recommend you all like do some Google stalking of Ayana after this. You need some inspiration. I feel like a nerdy mom when I do that, hyping you, but I can't help myself. Okay, so changing gears, what does this have to do with the workplace? So obviously we have sat in community with people for literally a decade today, talking about what loss is like for them. And there's these consistent themes that emerge, as you can imagine. We talk about shifting family dynamics. We talk about relationships and love. We talk about friendships. We talk a lot about surviving family members and how do we manage those dynamics. Also, what pretty much always comes up is something about work. And we hear oftentimes sort of one of two polarities. We hear from people that going back to work after a loss can be an amazing source of community, can be a place to really anchor, can be, you know, give us something to do to take our mind off of what's happening at home. Or people go back to work and they're like, oh gosh, the place where I work talks about mental health and putting people first, but my manager couldn't even look me in the eyes when I came back from my loss, let alone like take any work off my plate. And we hear a lot about that kind of reaction leading to people losing engagement in their job, wanting to look for other work, overall feeling like some kind of career transition is needed because their employers didn't know where to begin when it came to showing up for them. So our kind of insight that we've been playing with in the program that we've launched is, okay, workplace culture around loss is a make or break for employee engagement. How can we help by taking the tools that we've learned and the conversations we've had, develop resources that support employers to create more of the positive version of that story for them, for their bottom line, but also for our people, the people that are coming into their offices every day. And in the research that we've done, as we have more and more conversations with professionals who sit in sort of the HR, talent, culture offices, pretty much unanimously know that loss is present in their workplace, before COVID, but absolutely present now that we're living in this COVID reality. But they lack the skills to know what to say, to do. And they also lack the confidence. There was a lot of like, we have a paragraph in the employee handbook about how to manage loss, but no other conversation or training has ever been had beyond that. And of course, in 2020, suddenly this issue that some HR, culture, talent managers within workplaces could sort of afford to avoid or could keep swept under the rug is no longer something that we cannot look at. We are all very much universally grieving losses now, not death loss specifically, but loss in its many forms. And this is no longer sort of a nice to have conversation, but is really a business necessity, whether we're a nonprofit, whether we're a school, whether we're a corporation. So we have developed and are now leading with a bunch of different teams that I'll share with you in a second, a sort of series of workshops where we are training leadership, training teams, managers, and also individuals on the skills and the tools that they need to create emotionally resilient workplaces. For leadership, we're talking about what is the plan that you have in place, your readiness plan, so to speak, so that when somebody is suffering from a loss experience, you're not caught off guard. We're facilitating conversations between teams just to get people talking about how do we create more peer care and collective care across different employee groups, because it won't always just build itself. We're training managers and how do you actually sit and talk with someone who's experiencing a loss to get them re-engaged or to get them to articulate what it is that they need to get back on track. And this is not about becoming a counselor or a therapist. It's not about extracting personal information. It's really just about being able to sit with someone who's in a moment of grief and work them back to a place where they can re-engage. And we're also running workshops around building individual emotional resilience, because I'm sure, as we all know, if we don't have our feet underneath us, how can we be there for our teams? And how do we show up for the people around us? So bringing in pretty simple but powerful tools that help people create their own sort of emotional resilience plans, so to speak. And what's interesting about this work is that what we've experienced so far is that the need for it is universal. You know, we're working with technology companies like Redfin. We are working with Banner, the largest hospital network in the Southwest. We're working with a music label and a foster care agency and gigantic tech companies. And we've even done some work with the Professional Bull Riders Association, which I like chuckle at and just love. But really, there's no industry, there's no sector, there's no company size, there's no sort of tenure where loss isn't now a part of every organization's conversation. And we are loving bringing everything that we've learned into these places just to help them be a little bit more sensitive and resilient. And what we're hearing is that people who are participating in our trainings are really feeling a fire lit to do better, and to know that there have been many moments where they have delayed in having a conversation or didn't know what to say or said the wrong thing, but it's really not time anymore for sort of those feelings or those excuses. And how do we just really skill up quickly so that we can be there for our people in the coming years? And a really important reframing in this work for us is like, yes, the majority of the dinner parties work has been in being with people who have experienced death loss of someone significant in their lives, but loss is being experienced in so many different forms right now, you know, from plans and normalcy, financial security, people are losing their homes, being able to, we're working with a Banner, a hospital in the Southwest, and have been talking a lot about loss of the 20 minutes where you get in your car and roll down the windows and turn on the radio and drive to work, which might seem silly or trite, but these are important parts of people's routines that really help them stabilize. And now that those are gone, now that we're homeschooling, and now that there's no separation between when we're at work and when we're at home, grief is occurring. And it's important for us to open up our aperture and really know how do we spot it, and how do we know how to identify it when it's happening. So BJ Miller, I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work, a really amazing physician, talks in an article that he wrote about how, my mouse, just reemphasizing this point, like any kind of loss can cause us to grieve, whether it's loss of structure, loss of our role, loss of work. even the bad things. Even when we lose the bad things, that can be discombobulating. So I think it's our work as professionals working in this space to really make sure we're casting the net wide. So we're going to go over to the chat box, and with that kind of frame of mind, would love to hear from you. What is a loss experience that you've had personally, or that you've noticed on your team, someone that you're managing, someone that you're working closely with in, let's say, the last month? We just want to all kind of orient around, like, what are we talking about here when we're talking about loss experiences? I'm going to see if I can find my chat box. Cool. Yeah, Megan's talking about loss of in-person water cooler conversations, basic social connectivity that we took for granted. Yeah, socially connecting with in-person coworkers, colleagues experiencing death loss, whether COVID related or otherwise, loss of health, one of our most basic needs, pregnancy loss. Sorry to hear that, Salvatrice. We had a conversation recently with one of our partners where some people who were actually really ready to get back to the office felt sort of guilty admitting that they didn't want to work from home anymore, feeling like there was sort of peer pressure of folks wanting to all work from home and maintain that way of working. But I think a lot of people are struggling not having the face-to-face connection and the conversation. Loss of in-person collaboration, friendships over COVID safety protocols, very, very real. Loss of autonomy. Yep, fire evacuation. So keep these in mind as we keep going through this work, because I think part of our jobs right now is untethering the word grief to the word death. And actually grief is something that we're experiencing when we lose much more than just people. So we're going to do another, we can't technically raise our hand, but you can maybe put an asterisk or a plus sign or some sort of symbol in the chat box. Raise your hand if you have ever felt ill-equipped to support a colleague or a friend who experienced a loss. So are you a part of the club of people who are like, oh, I did not know what to say and I wanted to be there, but I just didn't know? Yep, I'm going to put one in myself. Great. So this is so common, and imagine all of us who opt in on a Friday to come to a workshop about grief in the workplace. If we don't know how to do this well, imagine so many people have no idea where to even begin and how to show up for someone. And now add another symbol if you've ever experienced a loss yourself and you didn't feel fully engaged at work, or your boss didn't know what was going on, or it led to you feeling kind of like out of alignment or out of sync with whoever you were working with. Putting one in myself. So yes, a lot of different symbols popping up here. So to me, what's powerful about this is that we've all been there ourselves. Like, we all know the deer in the headlights look that we've gotten at the water cooler when someone asks, you know, what are you doing for the holidays? And you don't know what to reply because, you know, you don't have home in the way that you once did, or any of the other moments of tension where we know that people want to show up for us, but just don't have the skills. This is not about bad intentions. It's about lack of skills. So the work that we'll take you through in the next few minutes and in the future session will really be about, like, okay, how do we shrink that gap between people wanting to do the right thing, but just not feeling equipped to do it? So we're going to talk a little bit about like the opportunity that we see in really taking this work seriously, which you may not always collate with conversations about grief in the workplace, but there actually is a really big organizational opportunity within this. There is this company called Google. You may have heard of them. This is a lovely bench outside of Google. And they did an interesting experiment a few years ago where they were really trying to understand what is it that makes their most kick-ass, so to speak, teams so kick-ass and so productive and so engaged. And they went about studying things like how many days a week the team would eat lunch together in the cafeteria. They looked at sort of the combination of introverts and extroverts on each team, and is there some sort of like super special ratio? And what they ended up finding I will tell you in a minute, but I'm curious if anyone wants to guess. What do you think was like the X factor to the super productive, special, amazing, overperforming teams at Google? Empathy, yes, close. Connectedness, great. So, sense of humor, I know, Anna, I want to be on your team. So what ended up coming forward in the bench, it was teams that could sit on this magical bench. Nice, Lisa. Yes, Randy, super close, safety. So what they found was psychological safety. Kat, also obsessed with this work. So having a sense of psychological safety is the thing that made this, the teams at Google the most successful. It wasn't like IQ, it wasn't, you know, tenure, it wasn't awards, it was, do people on the team feel like, and to read a definition of psychological safety, do they have a shared belief that there's room here for interpersonal risk taking, that I can be real about how I'm actually doing right now, and I'm not going to get fired, I'm not going to get dinged, I'm not going to be demoted, I can just be honest about where I'm at and the questions that I'm holding and the things that I'm struggling with. And from rework, I think Kat was your name who was talking about this. There's a whole deep report if you want to go down this rabbit hole. I like this kind of stuff, so you might too, but what ended up happening was teams that have psychological safety, there was higher engagement, people were less likely to leave, they were able to get ideas from other teams, they were rated twice as effective by executives. And to me, what's stunning about this is so many of the people that we work with who are coming from like a more old school corporate or institutional or government mindset, there's really this unspoken law that we are never meant to be vulnerable. We're never meant to bring in conversations about our personal lives or how we're really doing into the workplace. But what this research is showing us that like by not doing that, we're inhibiting ourselves from having the most like maximum productivity, the most impactful teams. So it yields us to have this question in mind of like, okay, cool. If this is some sort of secret special sauce, if psychological safety is like the thing that's going to get us to the next level, how do we actually cultivate it? You know, we all love Brene Brown and her work around vulnerability, and we know these buzzwords like resilience and synchronicity in the workplace, but like how on a day-to-day business do I practically as a manager create psychological safety within my team? Well, a place that we can all start, that unfortunately we can all work with as the most universal and yet exquisitely personal experience, we can all get better at supporting people who've experienced loss in the workplace and immediately start working towards building that psychological safety. So there's some amazing research that came up from an organization called the Grief Recovery Institute that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and they did some research a while back that found that 1 in 4 employees at any given time is grieving, which I think we could probably have all guessed, but it's powerful to see the number. And I think we could all imagine that that number in 2020 is more like 3 or 3.75 or 3.99 if you're looking at loss in its extended form. And for those people who are like, that's fine, but loss is personal, grief is meant to stay at home, what does this have to do with my business or my organization or my fundraising goals? It's actually having a massive impact on companies and the bottom line, like, you know, billions and billions, 75 billions of dollars are lost by companies because of sort of 3 different factors: absenteeism, presenteeism, where people are actually back at work but not engaged, and attrition, people coming back to work, not getting the support they need and leaving. So this is not just like a nice warm, touchy-feely issue that we're dealing with. It's actually a huge inefficiency in a place where we're really sort of hemorrhaging people and support. So a healthcare CEO we work with had put it so beautifully, and I want to just echo his sentiment that loss is a time when your company culture is truly exposed for what it is. You know, we can spend our time and money organizing the happy hours and the free lunches and all of the sort of surface level culture building that we see more and more. But if we're not able to show up for our employees in the moment where they need our support the most, what else is all of it worth? This is really sort of the most critical moment. If we can't get this piece right, then it kind of washes away the effect of all the other good intention stuff we're doing. Right, Leora? It is so true. So, and how the way we handle loss, what is it impacting? It's impacting employee retention, whether people stay or go. It's impacting our bottom line and how much work we can get done and how well we can do it. And it's also impacting our brand reputation. You know, in moments where companies are handling a loss, I've heard anecdotally from the people we worked with that kind of everyone's watching how companies handle supporting people during who are having loss experiences, and can really impact people's beliefs around or feelings towards your organization and whether or not they'd want to work with you or recommend you to a friend. So I know this can sound kind of grim, but the beautiful thing is that there are very concrete, incredibly simple, incredibly easy to implement ways that we can start to make a difference and start to, as I mentioned before, sort of bridge that gap between wanting to do the right thing and knowing how to do the right thing. So we can look at these sort of 3 phases or 3 ways in which loss is being mismanaged. We can look at absenteeism. So what happens when someone's out of work because of a grief experience? How do we support the team that's still in the office, probably taking on their workload? How do we get them back sooner if that's what they need? We can look at presenteeism. So someone is at work, but they are not actually at work. They are not engaged. Maybe they're arriving late, they're missing deadlines. There's a lot that we can do in simple communications tools and planning that just helps make sure that if someone's going to drop a ball, instead of ignoring it and the ball dropping, we can step in and make sure that there's a plan in place. And then also, I mentioned this before, but attrition of employees. We hear from a lot of people that the moment that they started to look for a new job was when they returned from a loss experience and they realized that this was not the place for them because of how they were supported or lack thereof. So our work is really interested in how do we create less of these kinds of moments. A woman who lost her husband told us that her coworkers didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to react to her. She ended up looking for a new job and changing companies. And how do we create more of these kinds of testimonials or experiences for people, not just for the one who's experienced a loss, but for their colleagues too. Everyone chipped in to help. To be honest, the amount of support I received was overwhelming. It makes me tear up as I think about it as I type this. And what I love about this was it wasn't one person's job to be there for this person. It was actually, how do we create a culture within our organization where when someone's struggling, people step in to help and really create, similar to the work Ayana was talking about, how do we create a culture of peer care within our organization? So we're going to go into a little bit more of understanding how loss is impacting our workplaces right now. From all of us, I think we can appreciate, in order to actually solve a problem, we need to know that there is a problem and we need to know what specifically the problem is that we're trying to solve. So I'm going to talk through a couple different pieces here. And then we'll move into a section where we're reflecting on what we've all learned within our own experiences, since there's such wisdom on the line. And then we'll do a little bit of work around what it looks like to create a readiness plan. So loss is impacting our employees. We know that employees are disengaging because of how loss is handled at work. This quote from a woman talks about her boss told me the nicety to take as much time as I needed, but didn't remove any work from my plate. I was afraid to fall behind and risk losing my job since I was now the main breadwinner. I came back to a mountain of tasks that felt insurmountable. So I think especially in a moment where many people are feeling financial insecurity, any kind of tension or difficulty re-engaging because of the mental, social, emotional impacts of grief can be sort of amplified by the fact that we all are also kind of afraid that we might lose our jobs. So it's something for us to be sensitive of as we're holding these conversations. But it's obviously impacting employees. It's also impacting employers. Managers are experiencing a lack of confidence because they don't have the tools to support employees after a loss. One anecdote that is important to share, not an anecdote, but more of a theme. We've heard from different companies that 2 people at the same organization can have the same title, been there for the same amount of time, same tenure. They can have the same essential job, but if they have a different manager can have a completely different night and day experience coming back to work after a loss. What we found is that the ways in which managers are trained, or the ways in which they feel comfortable talking about loss experiences, or feel comfortable bending the rules for people who need a little extra time, or when maybe they've also been through their own loss or grief experience as a manager, and what the person on their team is going through is triggering their own grief complex. If we have different managers, we can have night and day different experiences, and there's really no reason why that should happen. It brings up really big questions about equity and inclusion. Why is it that one person who makes the same amount of money and does a similar job as someone else is going to get way less support or way more support? So a lot of this work is about not leaving it up to sort of an individual's comfort and an individual's confidence in addressing loss on their team, and how do we buttress them with the tools they need to make sure that the support is equitable across the board. And a really important piece of this that we rarely talk about is, how is this person's loss affecting the broader ecosystem? So one person who is struggling, whether they're just having a hard week because of everything that's going on, or they've experienced a more significant loss, that person's disengagement, their absenteeism, their presenteeism can have major ripple effects across teams. It can create a lot of unnecessary tension. So this isn't just about sort of a one-on looking at this in an isolated situation. It's about looking at how a response to one person's loss experience is actually incorporating the lives and the workloads of people around them. And I love this quote from someone: "We all split up his workload when he was out, which was hard because it was our busiest time of year. But it did make me feel like if something happened to me, our team would do the same thing. It makes me feel secure and proud to work here." So again, by building the culture of peer support, you're showing people that you'll be there for them, and you're creating a culture around them for when they need it too. So our kind of challenge to you, or invitation to you, is how do we turn loss from this source of isolation to something that's actually a democratizer and a bridge builder? How do we turn it from something that can inhibit productivity and lead to the absenteeism and the presenteeism to actually a means for stronger teamwork and deeper purpose and a way to build psychological safety? And how do we see it as something that's just going to deplete our talent to actually build talent and trust between our teams? So we're going to hit up the chat box and talk a little bit about our own experiences within loss in the workplace. If you all are ready, I'm going to show you our first prompt for you to just simmer on for a few seconds and then chat in your response. So reflection number one, put on your employee hat. So think of a time when you've felt supported by colleagues. What were some gestures or actions or plans that people put in place that felt helpful for you, that you would want to recreate for someone else? Birthday card, great. Power of a handwritten note. It's free, it takes no time, but it can be really moving for people. The old cup of coffee, making a few minutes daily, a grief fund, amazing. I think maybe I meant flowers. Management team created a Facebook wellness page just for staff to share. Yeah, conscious of language and holidays. We hear from a lot of people that there's sort of we call it the Bermuda Triangle of the end of year holidays. Whether it's whatever December holiday you might celebrate, New Year's, Thanksgiving, and that can be a particularly sensitive time. I love Christie's colleagues taking tasks off her plate, giving her supportive text messages, felt supported and loved. A visit. Cool, Emma, curious about your weekly support group. Yeah, picking up lunch. So something that we hear a lot and that comes up in our trainings is like, how do we move away from like, let me know if you need anything, to very specific offers of help and support? It sounds like that's coming up for you guys too. Nice. So now put on your leader hat. Think of a time when you felt proud of how you supported someone. What worked? What would you do differently next time? Or if you're like, oh, what's only coming to mind is that time where I feel like I kind of whiffed and I wish that I'd done something differently. feel free to share those in too. Like what is your advice for someone who is trying to create a more supportive workplace around loss? Meal train. Yep, Lisa, the no expectation of a response is so good. We often hear from people that like, yeah, but they never wrote me back, or they never said anything to me. And we have some really powerful testimonials of folks that are talking to us about an email they received a decade ago that really changed their life. They never responded to the email that their boss sent them, letting them know that they were there, but it still came up in conversations today. Provided food, meals together. Great. I mean, we could create a whole guidebook just with the suggestions that you guys have today. And I'm hoping that as you're reading the chat, you're coming up with some other ideas of things that you could start implementing. Yep, Scott, checking in for longer than a few weeks. I think a lot of us kind of assume that grief has a time stamp on it and people will be back to normal after a certain time, but the checking in piece is so important. Leora's asking me to remind you all, brilliant participants, to enter to all panelists and attendees. And if you're chatting us in, make sure your setting is to all panelists and attendees. Great. So hopefully this is just getting your wheels turning a little bit of like, okay, what can we be actively doing within our workplaces to help bridge that gap between intention and skills and intention and action? Sharing, allowing the space for them to share when they are ready. Yep. When they're totally, Sonia, that's a big one. You know, I think some of us, and when we're in our organizational mindset, that's about problem solving and coming in and fixing, but for us, our recommendation is much more about how do we ask the open and honest questions, to quote our mentors at the Center for Courage and Renewal. How do we ask the open and honest questions that actually get people to a place where they know what's right for them, as opposed to being prescriptive and telling people what we think they should do. Concrete resources, great. So we're scratching the surface here, but I'm so happy to see you guys starting to generate some of the ideas, and you're already on it. So before we go into our Q&A, I'm gonna just give you a little sneak preview of the work that we're gonna do when we reconvene with this group. We hope that you all join us there too. So too many organizations that we've worked with, when we ask them sort of what is your organization's plan or approach to loss, and how do you know, in the same way that you might have a plan in place for someone announces that they need to take maternity leave or paternity leave or parental leave, how do we have the same sort of readiness around what happens when someone's experiencing a loss? And for many organizations, there's, you know, the paragraph in the employee handbook, and perhaps there's an employee assistance program or an EAP that they subscribe to that employees can use to get sort of crisis hotline or grief counseling, and that's it. What we really recommend, that we'll take you through in a second, is thinking about creating a culture of support as a 360-degree experience, and everyone within your organization should have a clear role and know what their role is. So this is not going to just happen on its own. It's up to us as people who work within organizations who are attending something like today's session to be the squeaky wheels and to really lead the charge to make sure that our organizations have the infrastructure and the policies in place to make sure that loss experiences are respected and cared for, and people can get the help they need to re-engage. So some things to keep in mind. This is not a like, oh, when loss happens. You know, sometimes we'll hear from partners that a loss experience just occurred and they're just now scrambling and thinking about what they should do. And we're there for them too, of course. But we really recommend, like, we know that this is not an if, but a when. It's probably right now. We really don't have any excuse to not have a thoughtful plan in place for when somebody on our team experiences a significant loss, or even an insignificant loss but just needs some support. It's super important to remember that while culture might be in one person's title, it's not one person's job. So if you are someone's manager, this is your job. If you work closely and collaborate with someone on a team, this is your job. If you run a department, this is your job. This is also an essential element for us, is even if you don't have fancy credentials behind your name, you can still do this. I think oftentimes we sort of opt out or bypass hard conversations because we don't feel like we know what to say. Even just saying, I don't know what to say, can go a really long way. So this is not just for the grief counselors or the professionals in the room, it's for the lay people too. We are highly encouraging that knowing less is more. Never in the workplace context are we extracting information. As was mentioned before, we're not trying to force anyone to tell us what's going on. We've heard really amazing stories from people within organizations who knew that something was happening in that person's personal life, never got the details, but did know that they need some work to be adjusted and it needed a little bit of extra care. And those people kind of returned to not only their normal levels of productivity and engagement, but beyond, because they had been checked in with, without ever knowing any of the sort of detail or nuance of the situation. And a prompt that I like to share with people is, how do we think about what we might do for a new parent and sort of people who are experiencing the early days of life, more happier news for some families? How do we apply this same sort of thoughtfulness to people at the other end of the spectrum, people who are in caretaker positions, people who have experienced loss, experienced a death, or are having struggling from all this uncertainty? And how do we make sure that if we're putting thought and effort into the early phase of life, we're doing the same, if not more, for the harder times? And I will underscore and bold this 100 times, but as you think through what is your employee or your team member's experience, how would their experience be different if they were a different race, age, tenure, seniority, if they lived in a different place, if they were a different gender? You can read through the list here, ending with vocalness. You know, if someone was less empowered or had less permission or had less precedent to kind of advocate for themselves and to really speak up for themselves, how might the support they receive be different? At the end of the day, the way people are supported in a loss experience says a lot about company culture, as the CEO quote shared with us earlier. It also says a lot about equity, and it says a lot about how we treat people across areas of difference within our organization. So that's it for today. We have some good time for a Q&A, so I'll go off screen and share in a second, but you can jot down this email address, info@thedinnerparty.org, if you have any questions or want to follow up. Thedinnerparty.org is our overall organization's website where you can find out more about the buddy system Ayana was mentioning, the virtual tables, all that good stuff. And then the /@work is where we kind of house some of our resources for workplaces specifically. So check those out. And then I'm going to go off of screen share for now. And I'm going to open up the Q&A in case folks have any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, the dinner party, Justin, Ayana. We have one question in the Q&A, and I've got a couple of ones that came to me privately. So I'm going to encourage you to take this time to put your questions in and your reflections and your comments in. So the first one is, what is your advice or recommendations on how administration might kind of push the EAP card, the Employee Assistant Program card, to help staff connect instead of having to have conversations within the group? And I know that HR is a big both potential platform and also potential barrier for a lot of folks when talking about grief at work. So curious, and maybe you can tell some stories about ways that folks have navigated that.
Yeah. So we are in no way anti-employee assistance program. I think those packages can be incredibly helpful for people. What we've heard is that, and this might be controversial, but what we've heard is that many people in leadership positions see it almost like a box that they've checked, even though they know that people don't often use it. So we've heard in a lot of conversations that, like, yeah, we do have an EAP, but like, I don't actually really know how much it's used. So there's something to look at there within our organizations, and yours might be different, but like, are we just checking a box there, or are we actually providing a resource that people are using? The other thing to really watch out for is, are we creating a culture where the messy stuff, the hard stuff, conversations about grief, conversations that are uncomfortable, are we outsourcing those to somebody else to have for us because we're not feeling courageous enough in our organization to sit with people in moments where they need for support. So I think that those are some questions to just sit with as you think about that. And I know that many EAPs provide sort of the crisis hotline options and things that you would never want to rely on a manager to provide, full stop. And we also need to make sure that our managers, if grief comes up, don't give the deer in the headlights look and like walk away or leave someone stranded without the help that they need. Do you, Justin or Ayana, do you want to add anything to that?
You hit it all for me.
I think the other piece that that I've heard in the EAP and then larger grief culture at work world is that EAP is a great resource for acute response, but what you're actually talking about is the ongoing, the universal, everyone, ongoing, long-term stuff. Yeah.
Totally. I think Leora, so right again. You know, I think that oftentimes the EAP support is like the acute grief counseling. Like I'm spinning out and need a human who I can talk to, but the EAP can't solve for that person's workload and can't solve for the fact that like they keep missing deadlines and can't solve for the fact that they actually have so much work on their plate since they were gone for a week that they're never going to be able to catch up. Like there's very concrete ways in which it is someone's job as a manager to be able to help manage that aspect of what is their loss experience that you can't send to some sort of outside company to figure out. We don't figure that out for people. What we do is help managers build the confidence and the skills to be able to sit down and be like, okay, where do we go from here?
Yeah. And Scott just put in the chat box, you know, EAP falls into the thought that grief should be over the requisite 3 days. And that came up in a private question to me about your expertise or recommendations for policy, particularly around bereavement policy.
Yeah.
And we know that bereavement policy is usually given 3 days. You have to prove who the person is. It usually has to be, I mean, it's very limited in understanding what grief is. And so curious about if you can expand on grief and bereavement policy at workplaces, that would be helpful.
Okay, this is my new favorite trivia question. In the chat, I would love to hear what is the requirement from the Department of Labor for what a company offers their employees when it comes to bereavement leave? Any ideas? Federally mandated, Kat says nothing, NA. 3, immediate family only, nothing, none. It is the grim response of none, which means you can extrapolate that someone who has experienced a heart-shattering, life-altering loss experience can go to their boss, tell them what happened, and be fired for not coming to work the next day. Which, like, you know, every time I talk about this breaks my heart again and again. And I understand that there are business requirements and you know, capitalism is a tricky game and all of these things. And yet it means that it leaves each state up to decide if there will be any mandated leave. Most states also don't have a mandated leave. There's some interesting work happening in Oregon around this, which means that it's up to every company to figure out what is their North Star and their compass. We have heard, I think the 3-day family only is very common. You know, the like gold star best practices is Facebook, for example, which only enacted this after their COO's husband died suddenly, Sheryl Sandberg's husband. And they offer 20 days of paid leave for an immediate family member, 10 days for a less close, but still close. I don't know how they define it exactly. And the more we're talking about this out in the world, the more we're hearing that I think Getty Images, someone heard from someone, they offer really progressive 30 days off policy. So all of that to say, you know, one thing we're working on with a couple of researchers right now is collating a bunch of different templates and examples and just sort of taking a pulse on what is the bare minimum, what is the stretch, given your organization size and how much you can afford, like what is something that we can kind of all feel good on. The thing that I would say is I think often the bereavement leave conversation can take all the air out of the room, and that's really only the first piece. It's like how many days off is an important part, but it's not the whole thing. And even if we have the most progressive bereavement leave policy in the universe, if that person comes back to a stack of papers on their desk and no one checks in with them and they're expected to just be back at 100%, then like we're doing them a disservice.
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions, again, that are a private chat to me, which is great, that I actually think that both Ayana, Justin, and Carla, because of your lived experience and your professional experience, you'll be able, it's perfect. So one was, how do I manage my own personal loss while providing grief and loss support? So knowing that the dinner party is comprised of staff, and we know this from your bios, you have beautiful bios that mirror who you are and a person that you're dedicating your work to, a person of loss in your life. How do we do that work? How do we hold loss for ourselves as employees and provide grief and loss and mourning support to those around us?
Ayana or Justin, any sage advice?
I was going to say that I actually think that the dinner party is unique in the sense that, as Leora said, all of us on staff have experienced a significant loss in some way, which also means that we understand what that's like. And we understand that sometimes we wake up and it's a bad grief day, which means it's going to be harder for us to do some work. And it's going to be harder for us to get the job done. And we offer each other kind of the kindness and the grace that we each need to be able to get through those days. So what that looks like for us is in our team directory, I make sure that each person puts significant days to them, and what that could be, it could be like for me, I put the day that my father died and his birthday on there, because I know that those anniversaries and those days are going to be a little bit harder for me, which means that maybe I'll take that day off, or it's on there and it's on my calendar so that folks know that if I'm a little bit short or if I'm a little bit wonky around that time, to just give me that kindness and that grace that most of us will need as we experience those anniversaries and those milestones.
I think for me, it's about really paying attention to myself. As somebody who works for TDP and I work as a death doula, and having lost both of my parents, a lot of my work can be very triggering. And so I know that before working with a client, before working with someone within our community, I need to create space before that call, before that video chat, and after. I need to not have something stressful that's bookending either one of those. And I've learned to step into my voice of saying, like what Justin said, this is a really bad grief day and I'm not able to show up for somebody. I think the more that you ignore that, the harder this work becomes, and it becomes unsustainable. So that would be my advice, is pay more attention to yourself.
We also, within our team, I'm not a part of it, but Ayana is. We've been reading a book called Trauma Stewardship, and having like an affinity group for people on our team who are like, okay, we're stewarding trauma and we have experienced it ourselves. And it's, it's not like, here are the 10 steps that you can take to fix this, but it's really just about having it be an open dialogue and learning from one another and what's working, and creating a community around that. Excellent book. Salvatrice agrees. Great.
Yeah, I just put the name of the book. I think that those two, those two concepts, I want to say personally, as someone who's experienced loss and leads loss conversations at work in the field, Justin, I've never thought about creating a culture of psychological safety where colleagues can put death anniversaries on the calendar, not just birthdays, but anniversaries or milestones. And it also made me have a lot of questions around how to support employees who walk through the world with disproportionate loss, where almost every day could be a lost anniversary, right? And what that could mean. So hopefully we can maybe talk more about that in November too. But that, what a beautiful, or even Ayana, your sentence of being able to have the psychological safety to say, I'm having a big grief day. Yeah, those are big. Okay, we have time for one last question. So I've got one, I'm gonna look at actually my text messages. And one is, we support the mental health workforce. A lot of the folks on the line right now are behavioral health, mental health professionals and specialists and therapists. And I will say, and knowing what Brenda just put in, very few EAP counselors have grief counseling training or expertise. So too with the mental health and behavioral health world, actually. But there are a lot of us in the behavioral health and mental health workforce who are not trained in grief or bereavement or mourning support. And so my question is, how might we as a mental health workforce, providers, counselors, interface with your work?
In so many ways. We have resources, free resources on our website that you can check out. We have a Being There in the Workplace guide that we released that's on our thedinnerparty.org/@work. So there's some things that you can just kind of peruse through. And, you know, this is what we're doing now, is going into workplaces and taking people through deeper trainings. I think for the next session we do with you guys, Leora, if there's a lot of interest around like basic grief sensitivity in the workplace 101, would be happy to kind of tweak our session to be more around that topic. And very happy to continue fielding questions over email for people that are like, okay, I need to skill up in this stuff. I think it's going to be a bigger part of all of our jobs for a while here.
Thank you. So I know Heather, I'm going to toss the baton to Heather. There's two questions in the Q&A that I think we have time for. I'm going to go into the closing session and get ready for our young people to share. So I hope that I can see everyone there, but thank you. And Heather, take it away.
Thank you, Leora.
Thanks, Leora. So the two remaining questions, we have one from Kendra. Holding space for these conversations seems like inevitably one would have the occasion to discover people who are in crisis. How is this addressed in both situations? What are the conversations around this?
Great. Justin or Ayana, do you guys want to take that one?
Yeah, so within the dinner party, as folks apply to join a table, there is an intake process. Kendra, I know that the first part of your question is more about how often do we find people in crisis and how do we deal with it? And part of that, a lot of that actually has to do with the intake process that we have, where we have folks fill out an application, for lack of better words, or a submission form that we ask them to share, you know, not only who died and kind of the type of loss, but also where are you at with your grief? And from that, we have a staff member that looks over each of those intakes and is able to kind of read through it and determine like, oh, does this person need an additional touch point to see what other resources we can provide them in addition to dinner partying? Because as a community of peers for our peers, and as Carla and I have both mentioned before, none of us have letters behind our name in the sense that we aren't licensed mental health professionals, we aren't social workers or therapists or anything like that, but we all have experienced loss and grief in a very significant way. And we want to make sure that as folks join the dinner party that they aren't using us as a replacement for therapy, but as a complement to therapy. And again, like we're really big about finding a sense of community of peers around that loss.
Great. The last question then, what can we do to make sure bereavement support is equally accessible to all in our organization? Many efforts of support are well-intentioned, but may not be possible or accessible due to workload, deadlines, etc.
So real. I'm surprised by the number of organizations we work with where while we're interacting with the team, they're learning in real time the existing resources. It's like a conversation that doesn't come up, or they're living on some Wikipedia or some drive somewhere that people just don't have access to. So I think there's a making the resources available and reminding people that they are there often. Someone might only really notice that they're there when they need them. Yeah, and I think it's a really good question of workload and, you know, how do we make sure that two people who have access to the same resources actually get the most out of them, I think is a bigger question that we'd love to talk about more.
I think in other sessions in the past 2 days, we've also talked and had some sessions about culturally responsive bereavement and responses. And so one way I think to make those resources accessible is to have them really be culturally responsive. And that means being really tuned into the person themselves, of course, and not just the culture that you might think that they're from.
Absolutely.
Thank you again for all of your responses here in the Q&A. Carla, are you able to bring up our last closing slides and I'll walk us through them?
1 second.
All right. So we want to have folks to remind them to please fill out the evaluation. We are, as Leora said at the kickoff here, funded by the federal government, and in order to continue our funding, are required to evaluate our services. So there's that piece, but really the most important part, we want to know what you thought about today's session, if you liked it, if you didn't like it, what we could do better next time, and all that good stuff. And I know our presenters appreciate the feedback as well. So please take just a minute. It's just a few questions to fill out the survey. And then finally, we are really interested in having everyone join us. If you could switch to the next slide, Carla. Up next is our closing session. I'm putting it in the chat as well. Listening and loving a conversation with youth leaders about grief and healing. So there will be a lot of good energy in this closing session, a lot of young energy, and we're excited to have those presenters as well. So please join us for that as we wrap up. We will also be very excited to see everyone back in November for round 2, where we really get a chance to take what we've learned in this first session and deepen it and get more in depth on all the topics that we've talked about. Thank you again, everyone, and please have a good rest of your day and weekend. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.